All right, it's the B Block Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Scott. Appreciate you for being here. Make sure you subscribe, rate, review. Get the podcast wherever it is that you get your podcast. You can also find us out here on YouTube. I got a few things that I want to get into today, but the big news as it pertains to Houston sports, there are a couple of things, actually. I'll get into some of this stadium talk in just a little bit because the new Texans president, Mike Tomon, was on with some of my colleagues, Payne and Pendergast, earlier Tuesday morning. And I got a couple of thoughts on that I actually did share on In the Loop, the show after Payne and Pendergast. Did that earlier in the day, but want to do that here on the podcast. But before I do that, I want to get to some of the on-the-field stuff because I feel like the big news for the Texans today is actually something that the Texans are going to be far enough removed from by the time the news materializes that it won't be worth talking about. But it is, to me, worth talking about today. And that is the fact that Davante Adams has been released. And the Texans have an obvious need at wide receiver, just weaponry overall. When you think about what happened with Tank Dell, when you think about the fact that Stefon Diggs is somebody that they're going to allow to test the free agent market. Okay, so who is C.J. Stroud supposed to be throwing the ball to? It's a question we've been asking since the end of the season, since the way the season ended. Who is he supposed to be throwing the ball to outside of Nico Collins? And you can say, hey, John Mechie and Xavier Hutchinson are under contract. They're players that are developing and that are getting better. But we all know that that is not solid enough of a plan for the Texans at the receiver position. So it begs the question, after the Jets make the decision, which I think we all could see this once it was clear that they weren't going to run the Aaron Rodgers thing back, that Davante Adams was going to be out of the door. Should the Texans be interested in Davante Adams after his release from the New York Jets? And I think there are two ways to look at this. How realistic it is his own thing, and how much you should want it to happen is another. And that's where I am. Okay, I'm in those two different spaces. Would I want the Texans, as somebody who wants good things to happen for the Texans, as somebody who wants good things to happen for C.J. Stroud, as somebody who wants to see the Texans offense improve from what it was last year, both not just in the run game, but overall, like absolutely want to see Davante Adams out there on the field with C.J. Stroud in a Texans uniform, the whole nine. I think that fans should be interested, and the team itself should absolutely be interested in at least pursuing this, or at least making a call, seeing what is possible, seeing what they could actually do. The reality of it is, it does not seem like Davante Adams is a legitimate, that the Texans are a legitimate destination for Davante Adams. I mean, let's just break it down. Davante Adams appears to either want to play with Aaron Rodgers or play on the West Coast, neither of which the Texans are able to offer him. Obviously, Houston's not on the West Coast, and they don't have and are not going to have Aaron Rodgers. Now, they do have C.J. Stroud, and I would make the case that Davante Adams should at the very least be interested in playing anywhere where there's a franchise quarterback already there. Not somebody that they're going to go draft or somebody they're going to try to pair him with, but there's already a young franchise quarterback that you can believe in. I think that the Texans should absolutely be on his list for those reasons. But he's Davante Adams. Right, he's got, I think, a very particular wish list and a very particular sort of circumstance that he wants to be in. Do the Texans meet his criteria? I'm not sure. Should he meet the Texans' criteria? I think absolutely he should. Absolutely he should. If you're thinking about a reunion with Stefon Diggs, okay, if you're thinking about the need that you have at wide receiver, then it's hard for me to imagine that, and especially after the news that we found out earlier that T. Higgins was going to be franchise tagged for a second straight year, which is interesting in its own right. I don't see how you can be a wide receiver needy team, how you could be a weapon needy team and just completely close the door on a Davante Adams possibility. Now, the issue is, it's not whether you would be interested in Davante Adams, still a productive player, still one of the better wide receivers, I think, in football, even if he's not necessarily the Davante Adams. I think he's still pretty damn productive and would be useful on any team. The issue is that the Texans do not have a ton of cap space, and it would take some creativity with the cap and with the contracts that they currently have and the structure of those contracts to make something like this work. But are you asking me, would I want the Texans to go to the highly paid players on this team, the Nico Collinses of the world, the Laramie Tunsil's of the world, the Daniil Hunters of the world, who only has 1 year left on his deal, right? And would I want them, the Azeez Al-Shairs of the world, the guys that are obvious contract restructure candidates, would I want them to go to those guys with the thought in mind that we could bring in a player the caliber of Davante Adams at a position of need? This is not a luxury item, by the way, right? I think that's the difference that we got to think about with this year, with any conversation you're having about a receiver, whether it's Davante Adams, whether it's Stefon Diggs, whether it's Cooper Kupp, whoever it is that you're thinking about bringing in. I think it's a lot different. The feeling, at least for me, is a lot different now than it was a year ago when they made that trade for Stefon Diggs, which I know is now very controversial, and a lot of people didn't like it at the time, and those people are doing their victory lap now about that deal, saying it wasn't good then, and it turned out to not work out for the Texans because they didn't get Stefon Diggs for a full season, and their offense did not overall improve despite having him. But the desperation, and we talked about this on the podcast before, the desperation to get a receiver opposite of Nico Collins is far greater now because of what happened with Stefon Diggs, and more so because of what happened with Tank Dell than it was a year ago. So I think that you can accept or acknowledge that maybe you didn't like the Stefon Diggs deal originally, but also accept and acknowledge that you need somebody like Stefon Diggs, like Davante Adams, somebody opposite of Nico Collins, or just somebody that's also a viable option for CJ Stroud to throw the ball to next season. So I think they should be interested in this. It is a long shot. It is unlikely. I was actually looking at USA Today putting together, and everybody does this, puts together like a quick landing spots article and just what they thought about the whole situation. And like the Texans aren't on this list, nor should they be, right? Like if you were to rank the possible landing spots for Davante Adams, like say the top 5, they didn't get the Texans in here, and I understood that. I understood why that would be. But should they be interested, and would I be interested? 100%. And this is what I would ask. If not, then where, like, if you can give me the alternative, I'll listen to the alternative. Like, I'm not saying they got to bring Stefon Diggs back, but I am saying, damn it, they got to do something. I ain't saying they got to sign Davante Adams, but I am saying they got to do something. I've put out the name Christian Kirk out there as somebody that I think would be a potential, like, reasonable person for them to go out there and acquire, somebody they could reasonably sign and would help them a great amount, a great deal, and probably wouldn't cost as much as, say, a Davante Adams would. And I'm honestly not sure what Stefon Diggs' market is going to be given his age and now coming off the torn ACL. But the desperation is there. You can argue that Stefon Diggs last year was a luxury item, but I think that the Tank Dell injury showed us the need for as many weapons as you can possibly have, especially when you're serious about contending, which the Texans obviously are right now. So Davante Adams, pipe dream, yes. I'm not here to like sell you something that I don't believe in, or something that I don't think is actually possible or true, or something that I don't think that they're going to actually do. If I had to predict, the Texans are not going to more than likely be pursuing Davante Adams. If I had to just predict it right now, more than likely not pursuing Davante Adams. Would I want them to? Would I want them to at least go down the rabbit hole of, hey, what does it look like restructuring Laramie? Just think about it. The restructure candidates, all of them are guys that you presumably, at least as we stand right now, are guys that you want past this year. It's not like you're kicking the can down the road for players that you only feel like you're going to want next year. I assume that you're going to want Laramie Tunsil past this year. I assume that you're going to want Daniil Hunter past this year. I assume that you're going to want Nico Collins. Not assume. I know for a fact that you're going to want Nico Collins past this year. You're going to want Azeez Al-Shaair, or at least you may want him past this year. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to push their money back a little bit to create the room, the cap space, to go get a player like Davante Adams. Now, another interesting thing that popped up, And this was a NFL scouting combine takeaway from some of the guys that were there. My guys like Jonathan Alexander, my colleague at the Houston Chronicle, Aaron Wilson at KPRC has mentioned this as well. But the Texans are also apparently interested in a Sheldon Rankins reunion. And this is something that I could actually get behind, because for me, when we identify the Texans' three biggest needs, defensive tackle is easily the last one out of the top three, right? It goes in some order at the top two: interior offensive line and weapon. And I think it's exactly that: interior offensive line and weapon. And then a distant third for me would be the defensive tackle position, which honestly is more so a product of the guys that they signed. A lot of the guys that they signed becoming free agents immediately, like those being short-term deals, one-year deals. And it's just time to either bring those guys back or replace them. And they talked about wanting to upgrade at that position. But for me, the defensive tackle position is the one that requires the least upgrading out of those three, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think you can make a solid argument for not upgrading the interior offensive line. I don't think you can make a solid argument for just running it back with the wide receiving core that you have, because you ain't really got one. So you're going to have to do something there. But in terms of the defensive line, the interior defensive line, they showed us last year that they could make that work, that they could piece that together. And honestly, over the last couple of years, they've shown us that they could piece together defensive tackle to where, while I acknowledge that if you get a game changer at that position, it changes the entire dynamic of your defense, I don't feel like it's as great of a need. And Sheldon Rankins is somebody, I would just point this out, and this has been pointed out by Aaron Wilson, and I think Jonathan as well, Jonathan Alexander, the fact, and we remember this, the fact that when Sheldon Rankins signed with the Cincinnati Bengals, it's not like the Texans just let him go. They got outbid. I think it was a 3-year, $26 million deal, if I'm not mistaken. 2-year, $26 million deal with the Bengals. And, you know, he's a cap casualty this year. And he missed the last 7 or 8 games or so. He missed a good chunk of the season last year with some type of viral illness of some sort that he's fully recovered from. So he's expected to go back to being the player that the Texans ultimately wanted last year and are now a position to bring back this year. I could get down with the Sheldon Rankins thing. I don't feel like that's going to break the bank for them, and it gives them an opportunity to try to use that money on a weapon or trying to piece together that offensive line. So the Sheldon Rankins news is the one piece of is the one little tidbit from, you know, some of the combine conversations that were being had that I was like, yeah, you know what? I can see that. I can understand where they're coming from and why they want to do that. I think that makes a lot of sense. Bring in Sheldon Rankins and then figure out a way to restructure some of these contracts so you can really address this wide receiver issue, right? Because when we break this down, offensive line is the one that it seems like could be most improved with coaching, even though you do need to upgrade the personnel in that department. The defensive tackle position is one where it seems like they're able to get by because they got stars on the outside and stars all the way around those guys, throughout the defense, between all-pro Sting and you got a slot corner that you really believe in, and Jalen Petrie, who you're also, those are two guys that you're going to be negotiating rankins extensions with pretty soon. Got Kamari Lassiter out there. Of course, you got your stars on the edge. You can survive with, Sheldon Rankins and Tim Settle and just some combination of guys on the interior defensive line. I don't know what you're doing with the weaponry. It is a dire. The Texans wide receiver situation is a dire situation that I'm not 100% sure how it gets fixed. Not 100% sure. That being said, Stefon Diggs could come back. Stefon Diggs could still come back. And I want to reiterate this, man. I feel like I've said it before, but I want to reiterate it. Just because the Stefon Diggs deal didn't exactly work out the way that you either wanted it to, or even if it's a deal that you don't feel like the Texans should have ever considered or entertained in the first place when they first did it, when they made that trade. Doesn't mean they don't need a dude like that right now, right? That they don't that they now. To me, it's more of an issue of like the reservations about Stefon Diggs is okay. How much of himself do you expect him to be coming off the injury? That is the big question. Not, is he good enough, or like does he actually make sense? A lot of the conversation around him, to me, it's strictly based on, okay, what is he going to be able to give you coming off of that torn ACL? And I don't know the exact answer to that, but you absolutely need to bring in, if not Stefon Diggs, as I mentioned, somebody that is a difference maker in the wide receiver room. So it'll be interesting. It'll be absolutely interesting to see if the Texans really to see what Stefon Diggs' market is, and if he comes to realize that what his market is basically what the Texans have already, whatever the Texans actually want to already do with him. So that is one. If I had to predict, I know we started this thing off with Davante Adams, but if I had to predict, the Stefon Diggs reunion is far, far, far more likely and probably makes a lot more sense for the Texans. Probably is, I think that statement is uninspiring for Texans fans because of how it worked out. But to me, it's just a different situation, completely different situation. Now, the thing that did surprise me from some of the notes that I read or some of the reporting that I saw from the combine is that it's expected that Shaq Mason, the Texans' right guard, is going to survive through free agency, and it's probably not going to be somebody that they cut, even though they could save some money. Like, his salary is manageable, but they could save some money by cutting him. But apparently the value of Shaq Mason on the team is a little bit greater than what my estimation was based on the way the season went for him. I thought that it was pretty obvious and pretty clear based on the season that Shaq had that it was time to respectfully part ways, let him go, and promptly start to figure out what the replacement is going to be at right guard. Like we talked about this, man. They got 3 interior line positions that all 3 could stand to see a new dude in those positions. All 3 could stand to see a new player occupying those positions in 2025. Shaq Mason, I think the guards are the most desperate of the 3. Left guard and right guard, I think, equally, because they just did not get good enough play at those positions. Now, center is one where they could try to figure out a way to piece it together between Jared Patterson and Drew Scruggs. But so, like, they at least have guys on their team that might could play center for them. I don't know how great they feel about guys on the team that can play guard for them, Shaq Mason included. So to see, I think it was my guy, Jonathan Alexander, who mentioned this in, for the Houston Chronicle in his, combine observations, that he doesn't see Shaq being let go during the free agency period, that he would survive all the way possibly through camp, and they'd bring in, the Texans would, some competition for Shaq, and then if he loses the competition, then he loses the competition, and they let him go that way. That makes sense. I can be talked into that, but it does surprise me a little bit. It does surprise me that they wouldn't just look from guard to guard and say, hey, we're going to start all over. We're going to start fresh. This isn't good enough. And like, we got a new offensive line coach. I know he's this former assistant offensive line coach, so he's not really that new, but we got an offensive line coach here, a new offensive coordinator. We're going to do different things, do new things. And flat out, the protection for CJ Stroud just was not good enough. Not good enough. So really, no one should be a given on that offensive line outside of Laramie Tunsil. And I understand that Titus Howard's contract is prohibitive in a lot of ways, so he's a given at least to be on the team. What his role exactly is, I think, is a question because of Blake Fisher and his own positional flexibility, if you will. But so those 3 are obviously on the team: Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard because of their contracts. Blake Fisher because he's just a second-year player who they just drafted in the second round. But the rest of the interior offensive linemen should all be fighting for jobs. If even that much. So I was surprised to hear that, but I can definitely understand where they're coming from with both the veteran presence and then also it being mentioned, and I hadn't thought much about this, but that Shaq and Nick Caley, and of course, by extension, I would not even just by extension, this is just the way it is. Shaq, Nick Caley, and Cole Popovich, the new offensive coordinator and offensive line coach, have history together in New England. Now, I know that whenever you say that, a lot of Texans fans recoil because it's like, okay, it's this Patriot South shit again. Here they go trying to be the Patriots again, or here they go hanging on to a guy just because he got some of that Patriots residue on him. But I do think that there is something to be said for perhaps the working relationship and maybe even an understanding of the player that is different from the previous regime, the previous guys that were coaching these guys. So I'm not trying to sell you on Shaq Mason, but matter of fact, I'm just telling you straight up, I was surprised to see that my guy Jonathan said almost definitively, not definitively, but pretty convincingly that he thinks that Shaq Mason is still going to be around considering the way that he played. But when you think about it, you can find a way for it to make some sense. All right, so that's my on the field takeaways from like the combine, from the weekend of news, from Tuesday's news about, guys that are being released. Of course, I mentioned that T. Higgins thing. We talked about this in the loop. Man, I you can be one of the ones that feels bad for the guy that gets franchise tagged 2 years in a row. I'm having a tough time with it. I really am. Like, I think about it like, man, this is very much unfair that T. Higgins is not allowed to go to free agency the way that he clearly should be. But also, 2 years just short of $50 million seemed like a good way to live. Seemed like it would have been a pretty good contract extension if you would. To me, you tell T. Higgins that he can get 2 years just short of $50 million, which is what he's going to end up getting over these last 2 years of the franchise tag. I would imagine he signed up for it. So good for him, bad for him, shame on the league. Like, I don't know. But good for the Bengals, right? Trying to figure out a way to nickel and dime their way to keeping this window open with these guys that they got. We'll see. But the other bit of news from the Texans world was the president, Mike Tomon. I hope I'm saying that right. Now I feel like this is embarrassing, but I'm gonna make sure. Is it Mike Tomon? Yes, Mike Tomon. All right, I got it right. Just making sure. I have not met the man yet, and enjoyed listening to him on Pain and Pendergast. Thought he said some really good things, but I want to and look. I'll take this time out to thank Dylan McGinnis from a few weeks ago being on the show to kind of break down the material issues with NRG Stadium, its relationship with the county, the rodeo, and where they are in these contract negotiations for their lease negotiations that is set to expire in 7 years. First time hearing publicly from Mike Tomon, I guess it was the night before he was on Texans All Access, but then he does the show with Sean and Seth. And I thought he said some really good things about at least trying to quell the concern that the Texans were about to ask the public to build them a new stadium. Because I think when they let go of Greg Grissom, when they brought in Tomon, and then just throughout this whole conversation, and I think it was also the follow-up work from Dylan McGinnis and Jonathan Alexander in the Chronicle that basically said out loud that the Texans could be interested and are exploring the possibility of building a new stadium. People automatically took that as, man, they want a new stadium. Just like for sure, definitively, they want a new stadium and they want my money and they want me to pay for it and I ain't with it. I sense a lot of that. I could see a lot of that. And I think that Tomon did a good job of at least calming that down a little bit by repeatedly, I think the night before on Texans All Access and then on Pain and Pendergast saying, hey, man, we want to do renovations. Renovations is our focus. That's where we're putting most of our energy into while we leave the door open or just keep open the possibility of anything, including a new stadium. But renovations, I think, first of all, I think that's good in terms of messaging, because I don't buy into, just because the NRG Stadium is almost 30 years old, that is some type of structural albatross that they gotta replace, and it's not some monstrosity over there. Even if you can argue that it hasn't been maintained properly, that the investment in the place has not been adequate, that the maintenance and the renovations just have not been there and have not been ideal. I don't think that you can argue, or at least I haven't seen evidence of this yet, that is a structurally unsound, unfit building that you need to either tear down or just completely evacuate. So like the idea that you would need to do that does seem a little bit offensive and ridiculous. So but the place could stand a facelift. It could stand a glow up, if you will. So that part makes sense. And I think it's a good thing that he focused more so on that. The issue is, you listen to him and you look at his background, okay, and this has been pointed out, but it was, I guess, somewhat punctuated by listening to him with my guys Seth and Sean. You don't bring in a guy like that to not build a new stadium. Like it is 100% the right messaging and the right public face to say that, hey, we're not going to burden y'all with a new stadium. We just want to renovate what we got. We want to be good stewards of what we got. And that's the way that they should be talking. But man, do you believe that? Do you believe they brought this dude in? And y'all go look up his resume for yourself, or go listen to him with Pain and Pendergast. You can find that on the Odyssey app or anywhere where you get your podcast for Pain and Pendergast. But you can't tell me that you listen to that guy talk and look at his resume and think they just brought him in to do stadium renovations. That they just brought a dude like that in to not build a new stadium. That's the part that I struggle with. The fact that he said all the right things and that I'm on point with his messaging about focusing on renovation and, trying to figure out the best deal with the county to make that happen. And, the county and the rodeo and all of that. But also, this a dude that builds stadiums, that help people build stadiums. Like that is why you make this kind of move. And he talked about, getting ahead of the negotiations with him being 7 years out. That's why you get ahead of it. That is this is the whole point, it feels like. So to me, it is fascinating to think about where this could go. It does not spell renovation, even if they're saying the right thing. It spells, we want to move, or we don't like this setup. Now, the important things to remember whenever we talk about this, and I pointed this out in the loop, this is something that we talked about here on the podcast with Dylan McGinnis. The Texans do not have control over NRG Stadium. It is not just a publicly funded stadium. It is a publicly maintained stadium. And and the county is on the hook for renovations. Like the Texans, all they do there is pay rent. And even that ain't really paying rent, because they make more on taxes most years, on tax abatements, than they pay in rent. So I compared it this way, or likened it to this on In the Loop earlier. It's basically the Texans at NRG Stadium is basically like a rich person that's living on housing, a rich person living in the projects, in government housing. And the issue is, everybody like to have their housing paid for. Everybody like to just say, hey man, you the landlord, you run this, you in control of this, you go ahead and fix all of this up. You go ahead and make sure that all of this is kept up to standard. But the reality is, government housing ain't gonna never be as nice as a rich people house, right? And when rich people have a house, they in charge of the renovations. They in charge of whether or not they keeping up with the Joneses, if they look as good as they neighbors, so to speak, right? The government ain't doing that, ain't about that. And this goes to the issue of how the lease there was negotiated originally, that the county wanted control of the stadium because they didn't like the way that the Astros maintained the Astrodome in the past, and they wanted to try to learn from that quote unquote mistake and not relive it. But this is now like the chickens coming home to roost, because that is just not the way that you maintain stadiums. You listen to Dylan McGinnis from a couple of weeks ago talking to me about this. They don't have adequate, dedicated funding sources for maintaining this stadium. They just can't, simply as a government, can't afford to do it. And as we know, the government can barely, damn near, if at all, afford to fund the things that are actually important in their communities. By and large, struggle to do that. Governments, local governments, struggle to pay for everything that they are actually responsible for, the important stuff, right? Law enforcement, parks, all of that kind of stuff, right? The streets, all of that. And homelessness, like the local governments struggle enough to handle those things, much less some big ass stadium that billionaires are staying in for free. So it shouldn't be surprising that the county is not able to keep the stadium up to the standard of the billionaire. And to the billionaire's credit, I think to the millionaire's credit, and I don't know as much about where the rodeo stands on this, but I assume that they're in a similar space. They would be willing to probably pay more and be on the hook for more, like shoulder more responsibility, if they also had more control of the stadium, of the property itself. And so that's the heart of this negotiation, I think, like beyond the idea of, are the Texans going to build a new stadium? I think, but like, or not beyond, before you get to there, I think you have to consider whether the Texans and the Rodeo can negotiate a new contract with the county that says that they have more control over the stadium and more responsibility in terms of maintaining and renovating the stadium. I think the meeting of the mind, so to speak, is going to be ultimately the public ends up paying for like a shit ton of renovations, right? They'll find a way to, bonds or whatever. They'll find a way to use that with public money. But then on the back end, the new negotiation or the new deal that they'll negotiate will be that the Texans also have more power. So they'll get the government to pay and ultimately the taxpayer to pay for a lot of these renovations, maybe not all of them, but a lot of the renovations that they want. They'll get the public to pay for those, but then on the back end, they get the control of the stadium, and the responsibility of maintaining whatever it is that gets approved. I hope that makes sense. I hope y'all got all of that. But that is my takeaway and where I'm at after listening to the new Texans president talk on Sports Radio 610 about this whole thing. Last thing I want to get to, and this is, since we mentioned the rodeo, I can't ignore this bit of news that I saw right before I came in here to record. And I was anticipating this because like this was just a word that, the big headliner for Bun B's birthday bonanza at Rodeo Houston was going to be revealed on Tuesday. We already knew that Jagged Edge, Keith Sweat, Coco Jones, Don Tolliver, and then we got yesterday Yolanda Adams. Okay, on Monday we find out that Yolanda Adams is going to perform on Bun B's birthday bonanza night at the rodeo. The big reveal is Ludacris. Ludacris will be performing at the birthday bonanza. And I just got to say, man, I am confused, very much confused by the organization of this. Like, I can justify every one of these acts. I can justify every single one of these acts being at the rodeo, being in the part of the birthday bonanza, all of them. Don Tolliver, Jagged Edge, Coco Jones, Keith Sweat, Yolanda Adams, who might be the most talented out of everybody that we're talking about. Out of everybody in the entire lineup, Yolanda Adams might be the actual best one. Ludacris, obviously. But as a collective, as a unit, as a lineup, bruh, I am so confused on the vibes here. Like, the vibe check is very, very, very confusing. I said this on In the Loop. Like, with Yolanda Adams, are we opening or closing with prayer? Are we opening or closing with prayer? And if we open with prayer, can you backdoor Yolanda Adams with some of the freaky shit that either Keith Sweat or Ludacris is going to be the headliner? So I assume you're going to close with Ludacris. But you definitely can't backdoor Yolanda Adams with Ludacris. Do you ease into, like, do you just start off with Don Tolliver, or do you get Jagged Edge in there where the party at? Like, how do you trend? Coco Jones is a bit of a sex symbol, if you will. How do you transition from prayer, from I open up my heart to the Lord, to the rest of these acts? Like, I think Yolanda Adams as a standalone for like a gospel night or something like that would be fantastic. You know, Yolanda Adams is a legend, an absolute legend. And again, probably the most talented person out of, at least as an artist, as a vocal act, probably the best one out of all of these. But how does it all fit together? How do these fan bases even cross over? Like, I feel like the only thing and the main thing that the fan bases for Don Tolliver, Jagged Edge, Coco Jones, Keith Sweat, and Yolanda Adams, and now Ludacris, the only common thread here is that everybody black. Everybody black. And I'm rooting for everybody black, but it's also a perfect example of how being black and blackness is just not a monolith, because I don't see much of the Venn diagram for the people coming to this show, right? Like, I went to Bun's show last year that he had, and, it was, Too Short and E40 and the Yin Yang Twins and Rick Ross, and Drake was up there at the end, right? I could see the Venn diagram and the overlap for the shows that they were trying to put on, for the shows that they put on last year. It's tougher with this one. Like, if you go there for Jagged Edge, you might also be there for Keith Sweat, but that's still a little bit of a distance between the generations of folks that really consumed and appreciated that music most. Or, like, are the people that are there for Don Tolliver also here for the Keith Sweat thing, and vice versa? Coco Jones and Don Tolliver's fan bases, both black, both young. Do they intersect? Do they cross over? Yolanda Adams probably, and Ludacris, I would say as well, but Yolanda Adams probably brings us all together. Are you trying to hear Yolanda Adams when you went to go hear Don Tolliver or Coco Jones or Keith Sweat or Jagged Edge? Not that I got an issue with bringing the church in. I'm cool with it. It's just, I'm confused by it. Confused by it. And then Luda. That's a good headliner to me. That is a good headlining act for this particular show. And I think that is probably the one that makes the most sense out of all of them. But we're kind of all over the place. Like, now I feel like we got some crossover with Luda and Jagged Edge. You've maybe got some crossover with Luda and Don Tolliver as hip hop acts. So maybe those are the connective tissue here that we're looking for. Ludacris, Yolanda Adams, bringing everybody together. But you can't tell me, even if you're a fan of all of these people, that you ain't just a little bit confused. I'm just a little bit confused. A little bit confused. And it feels anti-black, but I'm going to admit this right now on the B Block podcast as somebody that loves my people, loves them. I got tickets for the Post Malone show. Like I'm gonna take my. I think I'm gonna take my people to see the Post Malone show. I got tickets to go see Lauren Daigle because that is a favorite of my family, my kids. The mother, big Lauren Daigle. We actually got to see her right here in this studio before Kendra passed, just a few months before Kendra passed. There is a special like family connection to Lauren Daigle's music, and so that'll probably even be like a, like an emotional day for me and my family. But man, I got on these white acts. I got on Post Malone and Lauren Daigle and wasn't really checking for the Bun B show the way, the Black Heritage Night, the way that I normally am, even before it was Bun B, but the way I normally am come to Rodeo. Like, oh, what? Who playing on the Black Heritage Night? I was curious, and now I'm like, I think I'm good with ultimately what this decision was and the way that this is gonna go. Not that I'm not intrigued or interested or wouldn't go to the Bun show or anything. I'm just, for whatever reason, more interested in watching Post Malone out there. I know what I'm gonna get. More interested in watching Lauren Daigle. That's personal to me. Now, did I grow up on some Keith Sweat, on some Jagged Edge? Do I think Coco Jones is amazing, sensational? Do I think Don Toliver is a really good musical act? All the Yolanda Adams, okay, Ludacris, all of that. I grew up on all of it, or either grew up on it or understand it. Together, like, man, I could see people coming to see. I feel like this is gonna be a show where you get all of these fan bases together, but they are there specifically to see who they're there to see. And they're going to see everybody else just because they're there. And it's a pain in the ass to get to the rodeo. And it's not like you're just going to come to see one person's set. Like nobody's set is going to be long enough for you to just check out your artist and go, or get there in time for try to guess when your artist is going to be there performing. You just, if you're a Don Toliver fan, you just going to have to get on this Keith Sweat too. If you going to go see Yolanda Adams, be ready for what Ludacris be talking about. Be ready for what the Coco Jones experience might be. I don't know. Very interesting lineup. If you're going, power to you, and feel free to let me know how it goes, what you think. I remember last year my experience was, hey, I enjoyed it. I thought I had a good time. I mean, I really did have a good time, but it was one of the prime examples of going to NRG Stadium and like having an understanding of how bad the sound system is there for concerts, like just not ideal. That's something that they could stand to renovate. Like, how do we make it sound better in here? I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, let me know. Let me know what you think. I am not anticipating being at that show, but wouldn't mind just from a, not that I'm dying to be there, but just as a spectator, could be interesting. Definitely is interesting, but yeah. That's all I got. That's all I got for this episode of the B Block Podcast. Again, make sure that you subscribe. Make sure that you rate. Make sure that you also review. Tell your people about the podcast. Let them know. Grow the podcast. And yeah, man, until next time, y'all be good.